All right, the first step for sculpting our stylized character head is we are going to be gathering our reference. So we're going to take a look at some reference breakdowns, and then I'm going to show you guys a time lapse of me working, and then use a little voiceover to describe a bit of how I'm thinking and um, uh, slow down whenever it's necessary. So here I have one of my favorite references for simplifying the planes of the face, which is the Asaro head. So um, even though we are focusing on making stylized characters, it's really important for us to still be keeping in mind anatomy and studying and practicing anatomy when we construct our characters. Because assuming, we're working with a human, almost always, the best artists and the best stylized characters you've seen are abstractions of real people, right? They're abstractions of how the structure of our face works. And so some of the best references for 3D sculpting that you can find if you're going to be doing a human character is anatomy for artists. So anything that is described as anatomy for artists can be really, really helpful for digesting anatomy in a very quick way, right? Like you don't have to go into like a gross anatomy course for in like medical school or something like that to before you can start drawing things, right? We're artists. We want to think of things more as shape, shadow, and light rather than the actual construction of things. We will want to know what's actually underneath sometimes, because knowing that and remembering that can help us. But for the most part, we're just looking for some kind of simplification. So that's what I have here right in front of me, which is the Asar head. So here I'm going to go ahead and look at this a bit. So you can see on one half of it, the head, there's like a little bit more of a breakdown, so they have some more planes. And on the left-hand side, we have these larger planes. And my recommendation is to start kind of from something close to this. You don't have to go straight for this, and you'll see when I start sculpting, I don't go quite to this, but then again, I also have a lot of experience. Another thing is, we might define these planes and make them very structural in our first pass, but then eventually we'll start to lose and find some of this depending on what our task is or what our character is, right? So in some characters, especially masculine characters, this eye socket, cheekbone, jaw, it might be really prominent, but then in like a younger character or a female character, a lot of those planes and shapes you don't want to be quite there. So it depends on our design, of course. So, yeah, we're going to be looking at how this is essentially being broken down for us visually. And I'm going to go ahead and draw over it just to highlight some things, right? So first, I like to highlight kind of like the shape of the skull. So we'll be looking at a few more instances of this, but one thing to notice is that the skull isn't just purely spherical. And I kind of break it down. We'll see a few more examples, but there's kind of like let's go ahead and turn off the timing for a second. There is a front of the face, right? So it's like kind of like this part here, right? So this is like the mass of the face. And then we have what's essentially the sphere of the cranium, right? So we have this overlapping sphere that wraps behind it. So those things attached together essentially give us the skull. So looking at that sphere of the skull, right, we have this side plane, right, which is one of the first things we're going to block in is flattening this down. You can kind of see how flat it gets right here. Let's go ahead and drag over, right? You can see it has this like indentation right there. We also have these planes of the forehead. So if I go over here, we have this like kind of, whoa, that got really big by accident. So we have this, front plane, and then we have this kind of like turning transition plane. And something that's kind of important to note is that transition plane is kind of corresponds to the eyebrows, right? So you have this brow ridge, this bony ridge, which is caused by the skull, and it kind of has this like one part, two part, three part shape to it, that brow ridge, not the brow, like the hair itself, but the shape of your underlying structure. And, you can see those transition corners, like these two corners right here, correspond to that change in planes on that forehead. And again, like in real life, it's not, you don't have this like hard, sharp line there. This is an abstraction or simplification because it's going to make it a lot easier for us. The nose, I have a simpler construction of the nose that we'll take a look at. Some other things to note is this kind of cheekbone area, right? So there's this upward facing part of your cheekbone, right? And that cheekbone is one of the um, uh, most prominent parts on most characters that is going to be important to establish very early on is where that cheekbone is. And you can see it's like one of the most prominent landmarks right here. It's not the widest point, but it's close to it, like that corner of the jaw and that cheekbone, like right here and right here. Those are very prominent landmarks. And they also define some pretty big plane changes, right? So you have this like side plane. Let's go ahead and draw these. So we have like this side plane for the jaw, right? And then you have this, so this is, there's like essentially like this cheekbone bone that goes from here down to here, and then you have your eye socket that wraps around, and then you got your nose, all that stuff. So this side plane right here is kind of like that arm of the cheekbone down to the jaw. We have this upward facing cheekbone shape, right? And it kind of wraps around here. So this is kind of going around here, and it wraps around right around there. So those are facing up, right? Whereas this one's facing outwards. And then we have this grouping of muscles that is being abstracted down to our chin and our corner of our mouth. And you'll see this is kind of abstracted a lot in different ways depending on the artist, but often you'll see from the cheekbone swooping down to the corner of the mouth, you'll get this kind of transition shape plane right here and then a plane right here, right? Sometimes you'll see people draw that all the way down to the chin. Depends on the artist. Let's go ahead and clear that out and take a look at some other ones. Clear. Sorry. Getting used to this annotation tool. It's very challenging. All right. So coming back over here. So we can see that kind of swoop from the cheekbone down to the mouth right here. And then if we look at it from the side, we're kind of looking at this sort of rhythm that we have here. All right, so we'll have like ooh, it likes to do that, doesn't it? We have this kind of upward facing or flat forehead, depends on kind of the look of your character. Usually have a little bit of that arching of the brow. So right here we have this kind of downward facing, like that. And then we have our nose bone, and a very simple construction of the nose bone is going to kind of look like this, right? It's just going to sort of look like a rectangle or a cube from the side. And then, you know, we have the shelf of the nose. We'll have this flat surface that points forward and up, right? That is going to be the kind of mustache area above the top lip. And then we're all kind of familiar with how the lips look, right? They're just kind of like the top lip points down, the bottom lip points up. And then again, we have this down, up, down sort of rhythm, right? For the chin. So underneath the bottom lip, this is kind of pointing down, and the chin kind of pops out and has this upward pointing face and downward pointing face. So that's another shape we're going to be looking at. Also kind of looking at it from this point of view, we're also going to be thinking about proportions, right? So notice how the nose is almost always the furthest face or furthest point forward of our model or our face. The mouth and chin are kind of behind that. Usually the upper lip kind of protrudes a little bit further than the lower lip. The brow is behind that, so you can see that the brow usually isn't like on par or like lined up with the mouth. It's a little bit further back. And also notice where the eye is, right? So the eye is actually sitting back in the brow, right? So it kind of sits back here, and the corner of the brow is kind of wraps either at the corner. You can usually do it at the corner of the eye or a little bit further back. That's where that skull bone, the eye socket is. So the eye sits actually back in space from the mouth and the forehead. So it's tempting sometimes, like a lot of times when you're trying to match reference for your stylized character and you're looking from the front, is your face tends to get flat, but it's very dimensional in this direction, right? Like there's a lot of depth between the features. So, you know, having this reference can really help. Another important landmark that we're going to look at is where the jaw kind of goes straight up. And so this is an important landmark for two reasons. One is we have two halves of the head, right? If you like kind of broke the distance from the front of the face to the back of the face, this jawline happens right in the middle. right? So you can see half of the whole head is in front, and that includes all of the face. And then half of the head is back here, which is the skull. The other aspect that's important is this is also where the ear starts, and it connects right there, along the edge of the jaw. So the ear is behind the corner of the jaw. So if you kind of thought of the jaw as let's go ahead and clear this out. If you think about how a jaw works, right, it's kind of got this, you got this like lower jawbone, right, and then you have your teeth. So here's your teeth, and then you have your jawbone coming up here, and then you have, you know, the main skull. So here's teeth, and I'm not experienced drawing a skull from the side, so forgive me. Okay, so anyways, so this is where that jawbone is, right? And so where this arm of the jawbone goes upwards, right? That's where the ear has to sit behind it, right? The ear can't be on this, like, attached to the jawbone, right? Because when you open your mouth, your ear would be bending as well. And it's not above it too, because then that's going to be too high. So your ear, that connection hole for your ear is back here behind the shape of the jawbone. Okay, another thing that's important to look at here while we're kind of observing this is sort of where the skull or the cranium kind of ends, right? So it actually ends like the back of the head, the cranium, and where your muscles start for your neck ends above your jaw, right? Your jaw is like kind of dangles down, right? Like this, right? Whereas the cranium ends somewhere up here. So, what we're going to do is we're going to, when we block out our head, we're going to have like a sphere that's like right here, and then we'll either have a secondary sphere, or we'll do, a lot of times people will do something like a cylinder or some kind of cube to represent the face structure that overlaps it. But it's useful to know that that ends right there. Here's some comparisons of some stylized characters, and just to kind of show you guys what I mean about how those anatomy marks are still very important. So this is stylized, or this is a little closer to stylized realism, right? It's a bit more anatomical. It's not too far from reality. It's just some changes in proportions and exaggerations of some of those planes, but you can kind of see the exact same information showing up, right? We have this kind of corner plane right here. He's doing an expression, right? So his eyebrows are changing it, but we have this on the forehead, we have this side plane right there, and then we have the front plane right here. We have our side plane on the side of the head right there that corresponds with that eye socket cheekbone shape. We have this upward facing kind of flat plane of our cheekbone, that one right there, that's kind of showing up right there. Let me go ahead and start drawing on this. That'd probably be a little bit more helpful. So here we go. Right, we have this kind of shape here. You can see the exact same thing mirrored there. We can see very subtly in this case, right? Like we have this kind of plane distinction here between the side of the face and where we think the cheek is versus the front of the face next to the nose. So we kind of have this plane change here, and you can kind of see that a little bit from how the light is affecting it, right? You can see there's this kind of shaping here that's distinct from this shaping over here. Not as prominent or obvious is this shape, right? So in this case, it's not important for this character, or it's not part of their physical appearance. You can also see this upward facing plane. This is like this little area right here is a little bit lighter. We also have even here with this chin, right? Like we have this upward facing plane and then forward facing plane. Same thing here. Upward facing plane, forward facing plane. That area below the lower lip is also kind of facing down. We have the ears starting right behind the jaw, right? So you can see very clearly how much even this character who's starting to be stylized is going to be corresponding to that reference. Okay. Here's another example, right? So these are sculpts by this person that is based on the artwork of Max Grecki. So definitely very exaggerated in terms of shapes, right? Like we're taking a lot of those planes and then we're turning them into Similar but abstracted shapes, right? So you can see sort of this complexity of the forehead is turned into this like really interesting curve mark here, right? That nose bone structure is simplified into like a sweeping, like pyramidal shape, right? You can see how those cheekbones are really, really exaggerated and pushed. And then that separation right here, like where that cheekbone separates and you see more of the jaw and the flesh right there, is exaggerated in both these characters, which gives them kind of like a gaunt, bony look. So both of these horror characters are obviously kind of gaunt and skeletal, which gives it a very masculine look when you see those prominences of some of these features like the chin, the cheekbones, the forehead, the nose bone. That gives it a very masculine appearance. And you can see even between these two characters, they actually have very similar stylizations in terms of like the cheekbone is very pushed wide. There's a simplification of the brow region. We have this kind of undercarriage of the side of the jaw versus the cheekbone, right? So they really pull those cheekbones out. But look at that nose, right? This nose is like a blocky starship, and then this one's like a really, really long, thin kind of grain of rice. I don't know. I'm coming up with terrible analogies, but you can kind of see how where you choose to stylize is important for the distinct look and style of the character. But they're all still built on these fundamentals of anatomy. And then we push that even further with characters like this, where you're kind of familiar with the Disney and Pixar, DreamWorks look, right? Where we're starting to get even simpler, right? But still, we're recognizing a lot of the same ideas, right? So look at on this character from Pedro Conti and also this character from Julian Urrutia. I hope I'm pronouncing that name right. Right, we have that corner of the eye socket right there, right? Which is the same thing we have right here, right? And that's that transition for the underplane of the eye socket, right, up here. And that's the same thing here, right? And then that cheekbone, right, that part of the eye socket. So in this case, it goes down to here. And then on this one, it's super subtle. It starts to blend in with the cheeks a lot. So it gives this character like a softer look, which is, very common for depicting someone who looks younger or more feminine traits. We also have the same relationships of where that forehead is and the side of the forehead. So you can see there's like a side plane here that's different from the front plane on his forehead. Very subtle. It's kind of hard to see with his hair, but I can tell there's like a side upward plane. He's kind of getting that right there. Again, terminates at where the cheekbone is. Same thing here. And that cheekbone is kind of like that corner of the eye. We have that side of the jaw right here. Again, this guy is very, very subtle, but you can kind of still feel it. And then we have, of course, like the side, front of the nose bone, side, front of the nose bone. And on this character, right, like you can see both of these guys were doing this in a very exaggerated way, right? Like this character's nose, both of their nose bones effectively go straight down, right? And they're vertical. And then the parts that are on that we can kind of consider the bulb of the nose, like the nostrils and this piece of cartilage on the front, is essentially kind of jutting forward like that. Whereas on a natural nose, natural quote unquote, there's a variety of noses, of course. That kind of separation is not as noticeable, right? So look at how this is angled down, the nose bone, and where it connects and transitions into the eye sockets, right? And so both of them go straight down instead of pulling out. And then both of them have these very different shapes for the nose, right? So we can go over here and I'm going to clear out. So this one's very triangular. This whole character is very triangular, whereas this character is very round, right? His head shape is very round. All his features are very round. This guy is like very angular. So that's kind of how they chose to stylize both of these characters, to give them their unique look, but still basing it off in kind of abstracting anatomy marks. Okay, so here's just one more example. I wanted to show all the other characters I was showing were male. Again, we have just as much variety for female characters as well. So we can have that stylized realism where it's, a lot of real anatomy marks, a lot of the real anatomy still there. And we're just kind of changing proportions and kind of simplifying some shapes, but you see all those anatomy markers still. And then we have examples like this, which are heavily stylized, where still we're getting a lot of that structure, that bone structure, and where fat is on the face, but it's we're really lessening and abstracting out the those landmarks and shape changes, right? So again, we're seeing that side of the jaw right here, right? You can kind of see that here as well. We get this upward facing of the eye socket cheekbone, right? So we have that. Let me go ahead and clear these all out, right? So we have, a little bit of, it's not as obvious on this one, right? Pointing up. Same thing on this one, pointing up. We have that kind of jaw shape here, right? So we have the same exact jaw shape, just different prominences, right? This one's very prominent, sharp. Both these characters, to make them look a little bit more feminine, they're a lot softer compared to some of the other characters you can see, like on softer, younger characters or characters that you don't want to feel as masculine. That jaw is very subtle, right? It's like narrower. So in this case of Merida, right, you can see it's very, very narrow and pointy. On this character, it's a little bit softer and rounder, but it's neither of them are as prominent and jutting as this male character. And again, those nose bones, right? So in this case, the nose bone eye socket shape is here, but this character is very round and soft in that area, just how the artist chose to stylize it. So you don't notice it very much. With Merida, right, like in this from Wreck-It Ralph 2, I think, they decided to really sharpen and make that kind of like one of those really strong shapes and lines for face. And so you can see there's like this sharp line here. And so they decided to, make that prominent, but at the same time, right, like it doesn't have this kind of like angular blocky sort of shape, right? They kept these very specific curves and shapes that make the character feel appealing, right? Something else to look at as well is kind of the silhouette of the characters. We're not going to go over everything, of course, but you see at this 3/4 view, we have this kind of swoop of the jaw cheek up into the cheekbone. All right, kind of comes up into the eye socket, and then we have those corners of the eye socket and brow, right? So we're still getting that same shape on both of these characters, right? So kind of that swoop up. So there's like two swoops, like whop, whop. And those prominences of the cheekbone and the eyebrow, right? Those kind of two really prominent areas that we want to focus on. Briefly, I wanted to show this example by this Chinese artist. I don't know how to pronounce their real name, so their username on ArtStation is DiscoJJ. But it's really great kind of exercise they did where they did 3 levels of abstraction or stylization with a character, or Jenny Ortega, I think is what her name is, Wednesday Addams, right? So you can see much more of the shapes of anatomy on this character's face, right? Those shapes are complex, right? There's this subtlety of fat and muscle and bone underneath the skin, right? Still stylized, still, kind of abstracting the eyes out and the proportions, right? But, much closer to realism. Then in this case, like comparing the two, they've chosen to really simplify, and that's when we talk about abstraction and stylization. A lot of it's simplifying, right? A lot of it's kind of taking multiple pieces or shapes from reality and then either replacing them with a simpler shape or one that is not quite representative of what the shape actually is. So you can see on that nose, right, where it has this like complexity and softness and hardness to it. Here it has this very simple kind of curve going from here down into the nose, right? Look at that mouth has this kind of Cupid's bow kind of shape. Here it's just an arc, right? Same thing with that chin, right? She even has like a little bit of that dimple chin of that kind of bundle of muscles that are on our chins. And then here she doesn't have it at all. So let's go ahead and look, and even just like the shape of her nose, right? And so let's go over and look at this character, right? Nose bone completely gone. Mouth is just like almost a mark, and same thing with the nose is practically just like a little swoop. So I thought this was a great example showing how, the more and more we think of a stylization, the more stylized it is, usually the more we're abstracting those shapes down to simpler or less representative shapes. Also, we're not talking about it too much right now, but proportion plays factor into that, right? So like scaling up certain features that we're used to or scaling them down can make a character look stylized or count as stylized, but that doesn't always mean the more you change that, the more stylized it is, right? So we're used to chibi characters, but you can have a character that's this simple, but their proportions can be completely different and exaggerated, but just in a different way. So going forward with doing our head block in, these are some other simplifications next to the sorrow head that are pretty useful. Like you don't necessarily need to go for the sorrow head. This one's kind of like an even simpler version of the sorrow head. Here you can kind of see this one's more for a child or baby, but it also works well for stylized characters. Here's one that, is really like smooth and simplified, so great for that kind of level of stylization of like Disney and Pixar characters, or what we think of Disney and Pixar. Again, we're kind of getting those same ideas, right? Like from the corner of the mouth up to the cheekbone, right? I mean, you can see in this case it goes down to the jaw, right? We still have that kind of plane change from front up facing to side facing. Same thing with these ones right here. This nose, right? This is a nose I'm probably, so I use this one. I like this one a lot, this kind of idea or this approach, but I usually block out the nose more like this, right? This kind of simplification right here. And then we also are getting this brow separation, eye socket separation, right? So here we can see that separation of the eye socket right here, right, where that eye socket is. And then over here we get the same thing, but it's just abstracted out a little bit. And we get that, again, that planar changing on the forehead, right? Side plane. And then in this case, it's almost kind of like a curve or an arc instead of three distinct planes. But we have that there. Again, corner of the jaw is where our ear starts. More or less, the ear is going to start halfway, but on a lot of stylized characters, you can see right here, there's less back cranium. Same thing with right here. I tend to do the same thing, but again, depends on your character. Usually the face becomes larger than the cranium on a stylized character, that you'll notice. And then again, looking at this side profile, right, we have this kind of going up here. If we bring this one down here, right, we have that upward facing front forehead, right? We have the slightly downward facing transition into the brow. Then we have our nose bone, which is pointing up again, bottom of our nose pointing down. And then in this case, you can see they're really simplifying the mouth. We would block out the mouth separately, but you can see a little bit more of it here, right? Like in this case with this character feels older and a little bit more male, right? So those lips are not as prominent and fleshy, so they probably chose to like keep that pretty flat and simple. But on like a younger character, chubbier character, or more feminine character, you'll get more of like that lip prominence. So pointing up and then down, and then both of these they decided not to include the chin in that abstraction, and then we have that under the jaw. So yeah, so this is kind of like the approaches I take. A lot of times I'll start with something like this where I'll block in the cranium and then a face object. Some people have this like kind of helmet shape. It's a little bit more complex to make, so you can get one for like end up making one for yourself, or find one and start from there. But that's there's not as easy of a way to break it down as this example right here. Here's just another breakdown, which I think is from Anatomy for Sculptors, which is excellent. And kind of showing you guys a little bit, here's like that helmet shape right here. Just another way of doing it. But it's really useful to show that skull, just so we're thinking about how we're abstracting the head. Let's go ahead and bring this down to here. I should probably find a more stylized kind of skull shape. Let me go and do that really quickly. Okay, here we can see the transition of the skull, right? So in this case, this person's taking, you can kind of see this is like a realistic sculpted skull with real proportions, and then kind of abstracting that into simpler planar shapes, and then further abstracting it into like a softer transition shape. Here's another stylized example right here. So these are kind of showing you those key features that we were talking about, right? Like here's where that corner of the jaw is, and your ear would be right here. Here's that cheekbone, right? Right here, that is affecting so much of that plane change, right? Like a band of muscles from here to here, right? So from here to here, that's where we're getting our side plane of our face, and then we're getting more of that front plane kind of right there. That's just like skin and fat and muscle that's stretched between those areas. Um, really prominent or important is the eye socket, right? So here is where the underside of the eyelid is, and here's that upward facing and frontal facing corner of the eye socket, right? So if we go ahead and clear that out, let's go over here, right? So we can see that right here and right here. So you can see these are all going to be implying or including things like muscle and fat and skin. So a skull isn't always going to be the best way of showing this, but you can kind of see where those key landmarks are happening, right? Like this bottom of, or this corner of the eye is usually this transition from the upper part of the eye socket to the lower part. And then we have this cheekbone shape right here that goes back and where our ear is. There's the jaw. You can see this mouth area tends to be a little bit more cylindrical, like as if there's like a hockey puck kind of shoved in there. The nose, most of the nose is actually cartilage, right? The nose bone, if you feel it on your nose, is actually kind of only goes to about halfway on your um, nose, or what you think of as your nose. And then we see that transition. We're also seeing this like downward front plane right here. And then we have our upward plane here. So downward front plane, upward facing plane. We have our side planes, right? So here, here, and here, or here. And something that's kind of important to highlight here is this part right here at the corner of your eyebrow. So that's usually where your eyebrow is going to start transitioning from. You'll have your eyebrow go straight, and then it kind of, the longer it is, it starts transitioning downwards. It happens at that corner transition, and usually that's one of the most prominent places on your head. Before I get started, actually sculpting and blocking my head, I also want to make sure I'm gathering my reference. So here I have a pure ref board where I've essentially kind of put it in hierarchical order of how I'd work on it or how I'd be looking at it, also for ease of showing. And I'm not putting too many images on there. If I need more reference, like if I'm like doing something with the eye and these images aren't enough, right? I'll find more images either through a folder I have or just Googling on Pinterest or searching for Pinterest. But you see I'm starting from the top where I have like my base heads that I'm going to use for blocking in the initial shape, some stylized references that are showing kind of simplifications of that for a stylized character, because these are stylizations, quote unquote, but still with proportions of very anatomical. Then I have some more detailed examples. I love Anatomy for Sculptors stuff. They're really, really nice. Kind of shows you, it's still a little bit more complex, these kinds of examples, but shows you like more topological and three-dimensional sort of constructions of these planes of the face. Really helpful for 3D artists and 3D sculptors. And then some of these other ones where you can see here there's like this stylization of those features of the plane, and then here's this great example that's kind of showing you the differences between masculine and feminine features, right? Usually you'll see on a masculine character the jaw prominence is much more pronounced, right? We also have that kind of cheekbone kind of muscle right there that's really, really distinct. On a feminine or younger face, usually you're going to have a lot more fat or skin that's kind of softening those transitions so you can't see that anatomy underneath. Cheekbone or jawbone is a lot softer. Chin is a lot smaller as well. Nose is usually a little bit softer compared to masculine, right? So this nose over here you can see is a little bit more straight, but on this masculine character you can see this is the clear distinction from the nose bone of the skull down to the cartilage. And even the brow is simpler or smoother, right? So here that forehead to brow, right, is almost like a sweep or curve. Here we got like a lot of bumpy shapes, right? Usually, a lot of times for a masculine character, you'll see the front plane of the skull of the forehead is kind of like angled upwards a little bit more, whereas on a feminine character, usually that's like facing a little bit more straight. And there's less of that distinction of that muscle group that's above the eyebrows, right? So there's this like kind of a part of, I guess it's bone. I'm not, a master of anatomy, but there's like this bone you can kind of feel above your eyebrows. And on a feminine character, that's not very prominent, but on a masculine character, that is much more prominent. Okay, some other aspects I want to show you about my setup. So for my material, I'm using this material called Zbrush Paint. So just come in here. It's you can download it online. Just Google Zbrush Paint, and you should be able to find it. I oftentimes actually have a couple versions of this one. I don't know where the other one is. Oh, here it is. So in this one right here, I actually took his material. And so we went over to materials. Materials are funky. We're not going to go too far into it, but under modifiers, it just brought the ambient light down a little bit because by default, it's like kind of bright and just makes the shadows kind of hard to read. So I just brought that down a bit. And if you didn't like the specular color, in my case, the specular is like blue. So I just brought that over to like a gray value. So my specular reflections aren't tinting a certain way. But if you're fine with the blue, that's totally cool as well. So I like this material because it responds to the light direction. Matte caps don't do that, so just keep that in mind if you use any of the matte caps. Inside the light menu, that's where I have this little doodad down here, just changing the main and only light in here. Again, you can bring the ambient occlusion light down, so there's like actually ambient light in here. Not ambient occlusion, the ambient light. And again, I might come over here and just bring that ambient down a little bit. Okay. So it's just a material I like. It responds really well to lights. Still feels a little bit stylized. The more you edit it and like kind of keep bringing those aspects down, the closer it gets to one of my favorite brushes, which is the basic or favorite materials, the basic materials. I'm gonna come in here and turn off the poly paint. So sometimes I'll have to make this material brighter, right? And a lot of times I'm just working grayscale. But this one really makes it feel kind of like physical clay or some kind of plastic printed material because of how hard the light and shadows are. So it's really great to see kind of like the structure and forms of the face really clearly and how light falls across it. So I love switching to the basic material and just moving the light around and kind of looking at it from multiple different views. If you want cast shadows, you can click on the little BPR. So it has best preview render. All it does is just, by default, what it does is it just makes it so your object casts shadows on itself. But you usually don't really need to do that most of the time while you're working. So you can see that this isn't blocking that area over there. But we'll come back over here to that Zbrush paint. So it's just like a little bit friendlier and lighter for stylized characters. Another material I'll use is blend, right? So any shiny material, I'll sometimes use that just so I can see like, I can see in here, this area right here, there's like some wobbly area parts, just how that specular reflection changes across it. You can see over here, this is very smooth and flat, which is cool. Same thing with this area down here. There's like a little bit of bump right here, which I may or may not like. I might just need to smooth that area off. I can see a pull right through my topology if I come over here. All right, there's like a pull right there. So I would, if that was showing, I'd clean that up. There's definitely a pull right here, which is causing this kind of little surface distortion. So I'd smooth that out and clean it up. But blend can really help you see that. Another one would be basic material too. It's a little bit more extreme on the specular, right? But that specular reflection can really help you see distortions on your surface that you might not notice until later. But for the most part, I'm working with this kind of soft diffuse material. And just usually my light source, I'll put it mostly frontal, but a little bit higher so it casts shadow from left to right and top to bottom. Okay. I'm also using my own layout, right? You can kind of see this is my own custom layout where all the buttons that are hidden in all these different menus, I've just pulled them out because I use them a lot. I also have this little context menu that pops up when I press A, which has a lot of functions stored into it, just to kind of help as well. Things I don't use super frequently, but or actually these ones I use pretty frequently, like mirror and weld. These ones are a little less frequent. It's it's a work in progress. I also have brushes stored for my hotkeys from 1 through 8. So 1 is my standard brush, right? I'll just show those really quickly. Standard brush is my standard drawing brush. If I switch that over to turn off Z-add and turn on RGB, I can actually paint, right? So I can actually paint. Well, let's not worry about that. Let's go back to Z-add. So that's my standard brush. My move brush, which for this kind of stage or this part of the project, besides smooth and clay, I'm using the move brush most of the time, right? Holding Alt and clicking and dragging is going to move along the normals, right? Otherwise, it just moves according to your camera plane. My clay brush, right? So my clay brush is going to be used for filling in and volume. So if I come over here and I'm, drawing in something like this where I want a distinct plane change from the front of the forehead to the side of the forehead, right? A lot of times you'll get this kind of cavity shape. So the clay brush can be really great for like kind of filling in like concave areas. And a lot of these, just by default, Damien standard clay, they're just way too strong. So most of the time I'm just going ahead and bringing the Z intensity down. 4 is clay buildup. So it's a lot like the clay brush, does the same kind of actions, but it has like a more distinct shape to it. So it's great for building up volume and form really quickly. Damien standard is going to be your carving brush. So this is where you start carving out edges, but it's also great for sharpening and adding edges. So by default, it's a little too high. So if I come in here, right? Ooh, let's turn off dynamic. So you can see here, I'm just, if I hold Alt, I'm drawing a line, raising it. If I do a normal one, I'm carving a line. Okay. Hard polish, this is going to be your flattening brush. So this is going to be, if you want to take an area and you just want to really, really, really kind of make it more planar. It eats away at the volume, so keep that in mind. But for the most part, what's nice about this brush is if you kind of push on one side, right? So if I'm kind of pushing with hard polish on this side and I push on hard polish on another side, usually you get some pretty distinct shapes. If you hold Alt, it's going to do the same thing, but it's actually going to add a little volume, kind of like clay would. So if you start to lose the shape a little bit too much, you can go ahead and use that. So hard polish kind of like follows within the flatten sort of brush family, where it's just going to make more planar and flat surfaces. We have trim dynamic, which is like hard polish, but what it does is it makes a plane, but it really can emphasize killing edges. So if you have like an edge you want to get rid of, and you just want to kind of like add another faceted plane between two surfaces. So I did that right here. You can see there's an edge here. I just draw that on there, and you can see I'm making a completely new plane change with two edges. So that's trim dynamic. And then 8 is my inflate brush. So my inflate brush is just going to be, just makes like rows the surface in all directions along their normal, like that. I don't use it as frequently as all the other brushes, but it's there. The brushes I'm going to use mostly for this kind of block-in stage is going to be obviously the move brush, the clay brushes. So clay buildup would be for like building up a form, right? And then clay for like filling in a gap or adding some volume. So in this case, right, if I wanted to add some volume into that area and not have it be so concave. Damien standard for carving and sharpening planes, right? So we're just doing that, carving in new shapes. Like a lot of times I'll do that to like lay out certain features. So let's say I wanted to figure out where my mouth was, right? I might lay out right there and where my nose is going to lie. If I can look at it with my reference art, I might also kind of figure out where things line up, right? So like the pupil, maybe I'd figure out where that lines up with the corner of the mouth. Obviously doing things like carving in new areas, or it also helps with carving in new plane changes. So in this case, if I make it bigger and I go down a subdivision level, the nice thing about Damien standard is it really kind of like pushes in like a valley shape. So you can use that to kind of really kind of set this like new plane facing down, plane facing up, right? And then I can just come up here and separate those, and then use, Damien standard to sharpen that, and then clay and hard polish to kind of make those surfaces more flat and distinct, right? And yeah, those are essentially all of my brushes. The other brushes I'll obviously be using are the masking brush, right? So if I hold control, that's my masking modifier. So control, click and drag on my mesh is going to mask off a surface. Control tapping on the canvas inverts your mask. And then control dragging clears your mask. If you draw on a mask, if you want to subtract from the mask, you just control Alt. So Alt is always going to be the opposite of your brush. Not all brushes have an opposite, but anytime if you wanted to do the opposite, you just hold Alt for whatever brush you have. So Control is masking, Control Alt is subtracting your mask. Another thing you can do is if I've drawn a mask, if I hold Control and tap on the mesh, you'll see I feather my mask. So I can like invert it and feather it again. Control Alt in tapping does the opposite of feathering, right? So Control Alt tapping sharpens, right? So Control tapping feathers, Control Alt sharpens. And so you can see I actually can grow my mask and shrink my mask appropriately by just feathering and then sharpening. Cool. My selection brushes are Control Shift. So Control Shift drag will isolate things. I don't do that super often. You can switch it to mask lasso, or not mask lasso, sorry. Select lasso. And then so you can do that if you want a very specific shape. Something you'll see me do a lot of times is I will solo. So solo is going to look at only the subtool I have active, right? Even if other ones are visible. So there's the visibility icons. So I'll turn off solo for a second. I'll turn off perspective for orthographic if I'm lining something up. Turn on perspective most of the time when I'm sculpting. I'll also turn on polyframe. So usually I'll press Shift F for turning that on and off. So polyframe is going to show me my wireframe, but it's also going to show me my polygroups. So if I come in here and I mask, like let's say I'm going to go ahead and mask off this area down here, which I do later in my demonstration video. Right, so I mask off this area. If I press Control W, or if you go down to the polygroups, there's going to be a polygroup masked. What's also great about Control Shift, right, which is our selection brush, is if you Control Shift, and let's go back to select rectangle, and tap on a polygroup, it will automatically isolate the polygroup. So this is a great way to automatically like essentially save grouping areas. So let's do that. Let's say I did that on the forehead too. So let's say these are important areas that I care about. I'm going to keep coming back to. What I can do is just quickly Control Shift tap that. Let's turn that polyframe off. I can Control tap on the canvas to mask it, and then I can Control Shift tap on the background to bring everything back. It's Control Shift and Control stuff. You might be like, oh my God, how am I going to remember that? You just have to practice it. There's no just like remembering the hotkeys for it, just like Photoshop. You just got to get in the habit of practicing and remembering things. So with that selected now, I can easily like select and isolate a part. Again, if I use that mask feathering, Control tapping on that, right? Then I can just move things around and kind of change some shapes. So in this case, I'm getting like more of an overhang of the brows, right? Maybe make those a little bit heavier. Or maybe I'll grab, like select this area right here with the lips. Control tap that and maybe pull those forward, right, with the move gizmo. Pull the corners back in space. Doesn't matter. This isn't meant to be the demo. It's starting to look a little creepy. The move brush or the move gizmo. So any like moving, rotating, and scaling is done by pressing WER as a hotkey. There's also move, scale, rotate on the default. And there's also this button right here, which if you're on a brush, you just press W. Actually, this is switching, so don't worry. So pressing on a hotkey or selecting a brush will switch back to painting brush mode. Or you can also do T. So if you do T, Q, sorry. Q is also switching back to a brush. But if you ever want to do move, rotate, scale, you just press W, E, or R. Doesn't really matter. It's like the Maya hotkeys. And so this move gizmo 3D, a lot like the masking and the selecting your visibility. You want to go ahead and watch a video on how to use this thing, right? Because it's a little complex and I don't want to make this video about how to use ZBrush specifically. So those are all the tools and main aspects I'm working with. I'm also going to be working with subdivision levels very frequently and doing those just like with my masking and selecting things. You know, I'll do stuff like this all the time. And some things you might not see is I'll also hide my mask by pressing Control H on Windows. And you'll see the mask is still there. I'm not looking at the mask because I like to kind of get a sense of, sometimes the mask makes it kind of confusing as to like what I'm looking at. And then I'm also working with subdivision levels. I have mine up here. So that's going to be D, pressing D goes up a subdivision level if you already have one. Shift D goes down. And then if you need a new subdivision level, let's go down and delete higher. Press Control D, that's going to add new subdivision levels. So Shift D, D, and Control D. Again, these are under divide, and then there's going to be under geometry. You can go drag and go up and down between your subdivision levels. Yeah, I think that's about it. That's all the stuff that's not super specific.